Hey friends, what does your soul long for? Have you ever been hit with a wave of longing, just at a loss for words what to call it? What if I told you that those moments are deeply formational and there's even a certain word for it you're going to want to hear to believe? Our guest today says that those longings of the soul need special attention, and he's calling you and me to listen up. You're listening to Halfway There, episode number 362, Jeff Crosby and the Longings of the Soul. Well, hey friends, welcome back to Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. As always, I'm your host, Eric Devins. Thank you so much for joining me. I am deeply grateful that you are here. I don't know how you found it. Maybe a friend told you. Maybe you just were searching for a podcast about the Christian spiritual journey and you came across Halfway There. Welcome. I'm super glad that you're here. If you enjoy this conversation, and I know you will you just tell a friend or shoot a text out to a family member or somebody, let them know. And for those of you who are interested and you want to help out, you can always go to halfwaytherepodcast.com. We have a Patreon button right there. All you have to do is click that, and there's just a small little donation that you can make every month. Those of you that do, thank you. I really appreciate you. We're glad to have you on board. Okay, so let's dive straight into our conversation today. I'm excited about this and the connection because the subject and his book is one that I just really resonate with, and I'm excited to hear more about it, and particularly in the context of his life. Our guest is the president and CEO of the ECPA, the Trade Association for Christian Publishing. And the book that we're going to talk about also is The Language of the Soul, Meeting God in the Longings of Our Hearts. I think our hearts are so important. It's out by Broadleaf Books. He and his wife of 40 years live in the Chicago suburbs. Our guest is Jeff Crosby. Jeff, welcome to Halfway There.
Thank you for having me, Eric. Good to be here.
I'm delighted to have you. I lived in Chicago for a while. I went to Trinity, got my undergrad there. I miss the food.
Well, come back anytime.
It's good stuff there. Maybe I'll save a slice of pizza for me next time I get back there. I love it. Well, okay, so those are sort of the broad strokes about who you are, and I know you've been in publishing for a long time. Tell us a little more about kind of who you are and where God has you just right at the moment, and then we'll go back.
Yeah, well, currently as you said, I'm president of ECPA. I'm serving a group of Christian publishers. We used to say from Abingdon to Zondervan, so there's a lot of space in between. And but I have, as you said, worked with Christian books all of my adult life, and so I've been on the other side of the desk, acquiring books and publishing them, developing them, marketing them, and so this is a new experience being on the other side of the desk, where you're the one who authored the book and you're out talking about it. But very, very thankful for people like you who are helping to host conversations like this.
Is it what have you learned as you've been on the other side? What's surprised you or maybe changed that you weren't looking for?
I think I have a lot more empathy for all of those hundreds, if not thousands, of authors that I worked with over those 40 years. It's a very vulnerable place to be. You put down, at least for a book like this, maybe if you're writing a biography of Benjamin Franklin, it's going to feel different. But a book about the language of the soul, it felt vulnerable to write and then to go through the editorial process. And then particularly beginning along about April 23rd, when copies started going out and reviews started going up and conversations with people like you started to happen, you just kind of feel vulnerable. Anne Lamott, I believe it is, talks about, writing being like opening a vein. And I'm finding that talking about the book is sort of that as well.
Yeah. And that's how it works though. You got to share it, right? You got to get out there and open your soul a little bit, which is interesting.
You do.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you being here to do that and share with us a little bit. That's definitely a privilege to have you. And so I'm excited to hear a little more about your story. Let's go back and we'll work back up to the language of the soul, because I'm guessing it sounds like it's a pretty personal book, and so I'm sure some of those stories will come out as we go. You're in Chicago now. Where did you grow up there, or where are you from?
I didn't. I think of the state of Indiana as my home state. Although I moved around a bit as a kid to Seattle, Washington, and the Chicago area briefly while I was a kid. But rural Indiana, I grew up in a town of on a good census year, it would have been about 300 people. It's less than that now, called London, Indiana, and I still think of kind of that rural farming community as home in some ways. Went to Ball State University in Indiana and studied journalism. That's where I met my wife of now 40 years. And we both were planning to pursue careers in journalism. And indeed, after school, we did that for a brief time. My dream was to cover Major League Baseball as a sports editor.
Cool.
Hers was to cover politics and news. And we were doing that for competing small town papers when we sensed a call to reopen a Christian bookstore near Indiana University. And so that was our entree into the world of Christian books, was really to be a light, to be hope, to be counsel, to be fun for students at Indiana University. And we did that for about 13 years before getting into the publishing side, where I did that for many, many years at InterVarsity Press.
Yeah, interesting. I think maybe we may have met when you were there when SBL was here a few years ago. But
Probably so.
I think
I would have gone there.
There was a party, and I think I might have met you there. But anyway, it was fun. That was definitely, that's kind of when I was first getting into this and started to realize some of the relationships and things. It was very interesting. Fun. Okay, yeah. So you growing up kind of around Indiana, rural. Was it Christian family? What was that like?
No, I mean, not really antagonistic toward faith, but it was not. We did not go to church. I remember in second grade, my mother dressed me and my two brothers up in our blue blazers and our clip-on bow ties and our white shirts, and hauled us off to the local either Methodist or Baptist. I can't remember. The little town had both in it, and to this day, I don't know why did she do that? What motivated her to do it? I think it was Easter, but I'm not sure. So no, we didn't. Church and religion were not a part of our experience. But I was invited by an elderly woman in that little town of London, Indiana. She invited me one summer. Why she took an interest in doing so, to this day, I have no idea. She did not invite either of my brothers, because she invited me to a church camp, a United Methodist church camp. And it was in Santa Claus, Indiana. And I thought, well, that sounds fun. I went home and she said she would pay the fees and, to get me there and all that. I went home and I said to my mom, Ann Myers wants to, sponsor me to go to a church camp. Is that okay? And she said, well, if Ann's paying for it and you want to go, that's fine. And that was where I heard the gospel. That's where I was given a little business card size piece of paper that said, Jesus is Lord. And like, wow, I wonder what this is all about. And I was given a Living New Testament, the little padded green covered, published by Tyndale House. And that was my first scripture text, and I began to read it. So that was kind of the start of it all. From that church camp in Santa Claus, Indiana.
Very interesting. What an interesting place. I wonder that's an interesting name for
it is
for a town. But
you can send your kids' letters to Santa Claus. You can send it there, and they'll get a little stamp saying that it was postmarked Santa Claus.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. Wow. Okay. So you heard the gospel church camp and you responded and you got a little scripture. I love that you noted the publisher too, by the way. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But so this is kind of the start of your faith. How did that grow then as you were kind of on your own, and how did that start to become on your own if you didn't have like a family support? What happened?
Well, what happened in the town I was living in by then, the town of London, not where my mom took me for Easter in second grade, but by this time it's several years later,
Mm-hmm.
I think I was 14 or so, still wasn't driving. I know that. Went to that church camp. And when I came back, there was no dramatic conversion, but there was curiosity. I watched as other children went forward in this tabernacle service, and there was a lot of emotion and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of repentance, a lot of confession, and to be honest, Eric, I was curious, but I was also a little bit skeptical because I knew some of the kids and they were downright rascallian, and but the curiosity kept me going. When I came home, there was a bus in Indiana. Towns are kind of spread out, and so churches aren't necessarily in every single town. And there was a church bus that would come through London and would take me to New Life United Methodist Church. And so I just started hopping on that. I couldn't drive, my family didn't go, but I wanted to continue to learn. There was something about what I saw in that tabernacle service every night during the 5 days of that church camp. And so I started just going to church on my own. And then the youth leader encouraged me to begin attending what in Indiana in those days was called campus life. A lot of people might know it more as Young Life, but we called it campus life. And there was a adult director, a gentleman named Terry, who took me under his wings. He encouraged me to read Colossians. He encouraged me to read the First Corinthian letter, and so I did that. And he also he introduced me to the magazine at that time, published by Christianity Today, called Campus Life. It no longer exists, but I subscribed to that, and my world began to be opened up, not just to Christian books, but also to Christian music, or
Yeah.
Jesus music, they called it in those days. And I would read reviews and was quite curious about this whole world that I knew nothing about. And so I was discipled by Terry, a staff worker of Campus Life, and eventually I have no Damascus Road experience that I could tell you about. It was more like a slow growing plant in your garden.
Mm.
Some seeds are planted and boom, they're out of the ground and they're just flowering with all their regalia, and others are, they're planted and they're growing, but it may take a few years, for you to see the
Yep.
full fruit of that life. And my conversion was more like the latter. It was a very slow moving thing until I met my wife, whose experience was the opposite of mine in terms of church, and then really her family, particularly her father, took me under his wing and discipled me to the point of, if I needed to choose a moment of conversion, it was being baptized, I believe,
Yeah.
in 1982.
I love that. Well, I think there's room for lots of different stories, right? We all have different something. I've interviewed a lot of people from Indiana with that sort of I grew up in church story, right? Which is great.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. But I'm really fascinated by yours too. And the analogy of a plant is so good. I'm curious, is that like your personality? That sort of slow, is like growing kind of slow, but then all of a
Yes.
sudden? Yeah.
Well, I don't know about the all of a sudden, flowering with beautiful, beautiful uh, regalia or anything like that. But yes, I would say I'm a methodical,
Okay.
kind of some might call me a plotter, I suppose. I definitely I take time to make my mind up about people. I
Mm,
take time to make my mind up generally about authors. Do I really like this book, or does this seem a little contrived? There's a little bit of a slow moving nature to my introverted soul, without a doubt.
interesting. Interesting. I like it. So what I love, friends, I want to point this out for you. You may have noticed, but God does this very often, right? He will speak to us. He will lead us and guide us, in accordance with our personality, right? He will show, he knew what you needed, right? He knew
Yeah.
that there was no, so we don't have to put a pin on this is the moment or the day or what because you were always his, right? And you were always kind of in uh, this process, and he's patient enough to let your personality come along to faith
Yeah.
and fruition as it needs to, right? I love that. I love that example. It's really interesting.
Absolutely.
I love it. Okay, so you are getting discipled, you got married. I did want to ask you one other really important spiritual formation question. Growing up in Indiana, being in loving Major League Baseball, you could go a couple of different ways there, Cubs or Cardinals. Like what
Yes, you could, or Cincinnati
or
Reds. So
Reds?
the
Yeah.
nearest major league team was Cincinnati, and I'm told that my first Major League Baseball game was at Crosby Field in
There
Cincinnati
you go.
before Riverfront was built, but I was too young to remember it. My paternal grandmother, who weighed about 100 pounds and stood about 4 feet 11, she was such a rabid St. Louis Cardinals fan in the years of Bob Gibson
Yeah.
and Lou Brock and Mike Shannon and those guys, that if I had been anything in those days but a Cardinals fan, I'm pretty sure I would have been disowned. So that's kind of the way we tilted. But over time, I became more of a major league fan
That's
than a
good.
Cardinals
Well,
fan. My son is carrying on the Cardinals fandom even now, though they're having a tough year.
it's a tough year. So I am a Cardinals fan also. Growing up in Iowa,
Okay.
my grandfather was a Cardinals fan, and that's so lucky because we had the Iowa Cubs. I could have been, which is a whole different spiritual formation experience, right? A lot more suffering on that
Yes.
side. Anyway, it was
Yes,
that's
you had better years back then.
absolutely okay. Anyway, I had to ask because I'm a huge baseball guy too. I love baseball. Even in this down year, it's been fun to
Yeah.
watch and see that some of the guys coming up. Okay, so you're writing, you feel led to get into books. I'm curious about some moments. Sounds like you say your father-in-law mentored you a little bit and helped
Yeah.
disciple you as
Yeah.
well. Really interesting. I'd be curious to hear some about that relationship, and maybe if you have some moments when you feel like God was kind of leading you or feeling close, or anything that stands out where you're like, oh, that was kind of a light bulb that came on for you.
Yeah, yeah. The father-in-law piece is so he and his wife, my mother-in-law, owned a Christian bookstore in Indianapolis, and after I met their oldest daughter, I think they wanted to make sure that I was the real deal spiritually. They began sending books up to my apartment in Muncie at the university. Books by John Stott,
Oh yeah.
books by James Sire, like The Universe Next Door. R.C. Sproul's The Holiness of God, I think, came shortly thereafter. And basically, I think there was a somewhat of an expectation that I was gonna read those, and next time we were together, we were gonna talk about them. And so some people have told me, man, that must have been a lot of pressure. And I didn't experience it that way, even though he and I are temperamentally and ecclesiastically, we're very, very different people today. In those days, I was really I think I was looking for someone to tell me right from wrong.
Mm,
You know, having grown up outside of any legalism whatsoever, you know, and all the baggage that comes for a lot of believers from a legalistic background. I had the opposite.
yeah.
Like, you know, the James Taylor line of, you know, if it feels right, don't think twice, from Shower the People. That was more kind of the context that I had. So I was very much yearning for this, you know, black, white, right, wrong, do, don't. And my father-in-law brought that in spades. And I think there was a period of time where, you know, that gave me kind of a framework for a beginning to explore. And through all those books that I mentioned by Stott, authors like Stott and Sire and Sproul, all of whom IVP published, by the way, and I later was marketing and selling and, you know, being a part of making known in the world. The curiosity of that is not lost on me.
Hmm.
You know, that was very important because of my own family system. And in the book, I talk a little bit about my father, who was very distant. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't a harsh man. He was just a distant man. And so, for someone to come close to me and to offer structure and framework was really important in a season.
Yeah.
I don't think that staying there is the spiritual formation track that a Dallas Willard would suggest we stay on. But for that season, it was important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's interesting. It occurs to me, did you know Dallas Willard? Did you have a chance to work with him?
I did. I published his book Hearing God, and then a devotional with him. We would meet up at Renovari events, and he was he whoever he was with, he made feel like he was their they were his best friend. It was a remarkable, the John Mark Comer idea of the ruthless elimination of hurry or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that really came from Dallas, and he lived that. And so when you were with him, you had a sense that you were the most important person to him in the room. And that is an unusual characteristic. It's what I will always remember about him.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. And also thank you for publishing that book, because it was very influential for me. So
that's good to know.
It was, as a spiritual formation guy, that book in particular, I think I carried around for like a year, and I would just read and do. So anyway, that was like, yeah, wow. That's kind of moving. That's amazing. Okay. So I'm really fascinated by how that formation, because that is sort of one of the seasons where you dive in, and it sounds like you were just eating up, some of the structure and some of this work and some of these things.
Yeah.
What an interesting privilege to later be in charge of promoting those books and selling those books. Pretty cool. What were you reading by John Stott? What was the one that was helpful?
Oh, The Cross of Christ was
yeah.
probably that came a little bit later, but Basic Christianity was the first one that the in-laws sent me.
Yeah.
I believe that was published in 59 by a publisher in London, and then Erdman's here in the States, and eventually IVP got rights to co-publish it. So that would have been the first thing by Stott that I ever read. And with James Sire, it was The Universe Next Door.
Yeah, which is fantastic, friends. If you haven't read that, it's just a really good way to think about how the Christian worldview fits in with all of these other
exactly,
or compares, I guess, maybe is a better way to put it. But yeah, it's James Sire. Certainly you should be checking that out. Okay, interesting. I love how that kind of shaped you, and that process, you were kind of eating it up. Okay, so moving forward, you're getting into books. You had the bookstore. You're getting into publishing. What else like kind of happened and moved you forward there spiritually?
Yeah, I think there in some of your programs you talk about an inner journey, and I would say that there over the course of time that structure that I was sort of that I received and that I was glad for um, began to what the utilitarian word I suppose is not work. It began to feel unhealthy, and I found myself longing for a different way of looking at what it means to be a Christ follower, and that's where
I got it.
Richard.
Well, I got to ask, what felt unhealthy? What was that?
I said that I didn't grow up with legalism. I had the opposite. It began to me to I think I began to take on some of the legalistic trappings of that so many of folks who are deconstructing or whatever terminology we want to use for it because of their journey in the church are undergoing. I think there was a day in which, or there was a season in which I began to I looked in the mirror and I said, it's like there used to be a commercial for Shell Oil Company. You're the Shell answer man. You have answers for questions that nobody's even asking. How dare you? And just kind of realizing I don't want to be that person. When I not retired, but when I moved from IVP to ECPA, I gave away a library of a couple thousand books. I just don't have room for them anymore, and so I knew my IVP friends were going to be a ready audience for picking them up. And so I built these browser boxes of books, and I tagged them with the name of the authors and the categories and stuff. And over the course of a month and a half or so, I got rid of this library that I just didn't have room for. And that process of weaning, of pruning my library, I saw myself in my 20s, in my 30s, in my 40s, in my 50s. You could kind of see the inflection point. And it was after reading Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster and being introduced to the original edition of that book, Hearing God. It was published under a different title previously. So Foster and Willard and some other authors like Henry Nouwen, they all introduced me to different language and to more of a being than a doing. And so over time, the kinds of authors, and you encounter many of them in the language of the soul, that really have been over the last 20, 25 years nurturing me are those that you would have studied in your spiritual formation program, I'm sure.
Oh yeah. So all of these folks are definitely people who have had a huge impact in their work on me as well. Spirits or Celebration of the Disciplines, for sure. But then also I noticed, I couldn't help but notice your book. The forward is written by Suzanne Stabile, who's been on the show a couple of times.
Okay.
And the afterword by James Bryan Smith, right? Which is just like, I mean, probably last year. I love all my interviews, but that was one of my favorite interviews, was interviewing him.
They're both lovely, lovely people.
Yeah, just absolutely delightful. And what I enjoy is their I just don't have any other word for it, the maturity in Christ, right? There's just this like sense of just they know Jesus, and you're kind of glean a little bits of him just by being around them, right? Just by spending an hour with them. It's just delightful. So love that. Okay. Interesting. So did you have a spiritual dark night of the soul that went along with that sort of season, moving from feeling like, okay, I've done all the things, but there's some different kinds of ways of interacting with the Lord?
I don't really know that I had any sort of dark night of the soul leading up to that change from what I would call more of a apologetics sort of spirituality to a spiritual formation orientation. I don't know there was a dark. I mean, if there was, it was that day of looking in the mirror and saying, I don't want to be the shell answer man anymore. But I hold the St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul idea as a little more deep kind of thing than that. I do think that there was a dark night of the soul in terms of, and I believe I write about this in the chapter on spiritual transformation. There was kind of a season of loss and of that I felt like kind of was a burning in my life. Just I don't disclose what it was all about, but a season of a deep loss and probably depression connected to that would, if I've had a dark night of the soul, it would be that. But that was long after the encounter with Foster and Willard and Nouwen and people like that. But the practices that I had integrated into my life, particularly the reading of the Psalms, reading the Psalms as prayer, reading the Psalms as lament, reading the Psalms as petition. I think that that, along with professional support, led me through that period. So I think the practices that grew out of the shift at an earlier age prepared me for the dark night, such as it was.
What I hear in all of those what are really styles of prayer, kinds of prayer, right? Are uh, is the diversity that can handle and weather what we could call the storms of life, right? Like there
Yeah.
is that, which I don't know about you, but I didn't get in sort of my basic, Christian upbringing. It was the only kind of prayer we ever did was praying for the food or praying for each other, right? With which was essentially petitionary prayer. And that's
Right.
fine, and those it's very good. I've been a little more critical in the past, but I've realized we can't get rid of those things. Those are valuable, right? But there's more to it. And there's when we discover, and I love that you discovered that in the Psalms, even to because that's what they're for, right? To teach us
Yeah,
those things for sure. Yeah. Was
absolutely.
there one that was especially like good for you or
I
meaningful?
don't know that there. I mean, there were so many at different points, and when the pandemic hit and we were all sequestered, at least we were in the Chicagoland area for such a long period of time. That was a renewed experience of reading the Psalms devotionally. In that case, I was reading the devotional Psalter that Dane Ortland. If you or your readers haven't encountered this book called Devotional Psalter, it has meditations written by the author Dane Ortland, who's best known for a book called Gentle and Lowly. He pairs every psalm with a meditation, and that was a key thing that carried me through the darkest days of the pandemic, when I was wondering, how are we going to reopen IVP? How are we going to serve our authors? How are we going to
Yeah.
keep shipping books and all of that? My favorite psalm is Psalm 139, and just because of the way that it speaks uh, of how we're created, how we continue to be on the mind and in the heart of God, from the earliest days until our final days. So if I had to pick one, it would be Psalm 139. But at different times, in different seasons, different psalms have um, have done that kind of work in my soul.
Yeah. I love that. Wow. Okay. I want to know, was there anything as you've gone through some of those hard times and found yourself in the Psalms, was there anything you learned about yourself? Was there any like identities that shifted, changed, you let go of that you had to reframe?
I think that it was more, Eric, a recovery of an identity than it was a discovery of an identity. I think that over the past decade or so, I have recovered after so many years. And Suzanne would be the first to tell you that, kind of the Suzanne Stabile, who
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
referenced
Yep.
earlier, she might be the first to tell you that I took very seriously the sort of sacred act of receiving and caring for and making known, the work of an author's heart, like in her case, The Path Between Us or The
Mhm.
Road Back to You. Um, and I took that seriously, not just with the bigger seller authors like her and James Bryan Smith, but every author that I worked with. And somewhere in all of that, I lost my identity as one who has words of value himself.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
I had set aside my own creativity in terms of writing, not music and other things, but I think I had set aside in the service of caring for the words of others. I set aside my own words, and over the past decade or so, I began to recover that, and first with publishing work in journals like the Conversation Journal of Spiritual Formation, which I imagine you have heard of, or some trade journals or websites like Urban Faith, and doing some writing on music. And so it was more a recovery of identity and a belief that I might have something
Mm.
to say of value, to however many or however few might encounter them. And I do think that the spiritual formation, the practice of the examine of,
Mm-hmm.
where did I sense God's presence or goodness in this day? My goodness, it was actually not when I was reading a manuscript. It was when I wrote that, whatever, that chapter, that poem, that
Interesting.
journal entry. And the second, I suppose, is, and it's really connected to that recovery of identity, is the practice of journaling. I realized that, I did that as a kid, and I sort of set that aside. And it was really out of the journal writing and the listening to what was I sensing, or what was I feeling, that this book, The Language of the Soul, arose out of all that.
Interesting. I love that. So fascinating. I would not have um, anticipated, I think, that that journey of going, I'm publishing other people's words and what that might have done to you, right? As a thing. And then
Yeah,
that rediscovery journey. Interesting.
yeah.
Was it hard? Was that difficult to learn to write, or was it just a matter of recognizing it?
No, I've written, like I said, since as young as my memory can take me, and studied journalism, was
Yeah, yeah.
writing as a sports editor. So it writing, I won't say it's easy. Any of your listeners who are authors would say, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So it's definitely not easy, but the recovery was easy. The sitting down and just kind of saying to oneself, I believe this is what I'm to do. I'm to, yes, continue to help other writers, but I'm also to recover, not just my voice in terms of speaking, but writing. That wasn't hard. It was a joy. And the I started getting up at like 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning, going to Panera Bread before work, and I just put my bottom in the chair, and I said, you're going to write for an hour.
Yeah.
And I found it to be joy. It's not that it's easy, but it's joy. And I think that's when we are operating out of a strong sense of who God has wired you to be. And for me, it's much more of a written communicator than a speaker. I still get terrified standing up in front of people, although I have to do it. Um, yeah, that it wasn't hard. It was joy. The act of writing well, of rewriting, of editing, of having your,
Yep.
as one writer says, having your darlings killed out of your manuscript.
Yes.
That's hard. But the sit down, do it, recovery process was joy.
I love that.
Absolutely.
I love that. And friends, that is the thing. So along your journey, um, as you like look for those things that give you joy, right? That give you I was taught, maybe not intentionally, but we did, when we talked about joy, it was like this ethereal thing that you didn't actually experience emotionally, or that it was like
Mm-hmm.
you had to do, if you were going to serve God, he was going to call you to some place where there's large snakes, whatever, something like that. But it's not like that. It's actually, he's giving you desires. He's giving you things that when you do them, you feel the joy of God. Like that Eric Lytle quote, like when you feel running. I'm
Oh yeah.
messing it up, but you know what? We'll allude to it. We'll call it an illusion. But so I love that. And I love the chance to talk about it. Okay. So you mentioned, getting back into writing it. I'm really curious, um, you know, about meeting God in the longings of our hearts. I want you to talk about that, and particularly this word, because you have this word, this definition in here, and I want you and it's in the introduction. I want you to talk about that and kind of how that connects to most of us and how people feel it.
Yeah. So the word you're referring to is pronounced saudade. It's a Portuguese word. And there is thought to be an untranslatable emotion. Linguists talk about it that way. There's not a direct English translation or equivalent. It's kind of like the French word prairie really means meadow, and but they're kind of similar, prairie, meadow. And so saudade, I connect to the notion of longing. I'm not the first one to do it, but I have a Portuguese, a Brazilian friend, a Portuguese-speaking friend. His name is Joaquim Fragoso, and he and I worked together for a number of years. And in one of my earliest conversations with him, knowing where he came from and knowing that he would know the word saudade, I said, Joaquin, I want to say a word to you, and I want you to tell me what it means to you. And so I said, saudade. His eyes filled with tears. He said, "You know the word? You know the word?" We Portuguese-speaking people think of that word every day, multiple times of the day. It is so much a part of Portuguese culture. So, as I said, I connect it to the idea of longing. Um, it came to me, saudade, not through a book, but through jazz and bossa nova and samba music, and more a bit later, fado music out of Portugal. I'm a huge music fan, even though I've worked in books all of my life. And so back even in the 1980s, I would see these recordings by João Gilberto or Antonio Carlos Jobim, people like this, Astrid Gilberto, Stan Getz, and I just wanted to know what does this mean? They have these songs called Saudade. I've got to know. And over time, I studied, I looked, I read, and at some point, I thought I want to write about that. I want to write about it. So then, when I told Joaquin that word, and tears filled his eyes, and he was so joyful that I knew it. We sat down and we talked, and that was really kind of the genesis of this book, which it took me about 15 years to write. I don't recommend that to prospective authors necessarily, but I tried to think through, as Joaquin and I would dialogue, and his saudade might be about the loss of his father, or it might be the loss of his homeland, living now in the Chicago area, the loss of the landscape of Brazil, the loss of access to the rainforest that he would have known, and think those would be his saudades. And I was sort of, well, what are mine? And I wind up coming up with 10, beginning with home, ending with heaven, and 8 in between. And I just attempted to sort of sift through, okay, if those are my longings, how has God met me in them, which is different than saying, how has God met them? How have I been met by God within a longing for home, or a longing for forgiveness, or a longing for friendship? And that's what it's all about. And so just over those 15 years, kind of pecked away at thinking about it, praying through, what did I believe, and beginning to sit down and write. So it came out of a vinyl LP by João Gilberto, a Brazilian jazz artist, and a song called Chega de Saudade.
Wow. Fascinating. I feel like too, this idea of saudade is, it almost feels like an implicitly Christian idea, right? Like, I don't know, I don't know if that's appropriating it or what that is, but it's like, it is that already a not yet idea, right? Like we are here, the kingdom has come, and yet we yearn for God to make it so plain, so evident, immediate, and final, right? Like just to come and make it so,
exactly.
right?
To make all things new, right? But they're not yet.
But they are not yet. But we have this promise that we hold on to. It's like this thing that so when I read it, I was like, oh, that's so fascinating as a thing to capture that piece of a heart. And I've certainly felt, I've longed for it. Those are some of the moments that I love most. I once said on a podcast interview that I think about, I don't know if anybody ever listened to it. It was with a friend, about how there are moments when I can feel really connected to the whole world, right? Or I feel the sadness of the tragedy of human beings hurting each other, right? Like there's these things like that that really maybe are connected to some of these like longings for justice and righteousness and for Jesus to put everything right.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Those are saudades you carry in your heart,
Yeah.
Eric. Absolutely.
How can our audience, if they like, if you were to help them go, okay, what are your longings and how can how can they recognize Jesus and how he's meeting them in them?
I think that is unique probably for each person. The pathway for me was through music, it was through journaling, it was through walks in nature. My wife is also a writer, but she's an environmental educator, and we spend a lot of time in along lakes, along rivers and forests, and out in the woods and so forth. Those were some of the ways for me. Praying the examen in the morning or the night. I suspect it is unique for each person because we are, though all made in the image of God, we are unique people. But I think for all of us, probably part of the task is to slow down enough to be in touch with our own internal talk, with to be in touch with what is aggravating us, or what is bringing us joy. Just to not stay in the hamster wheel all the time. I mean, we all have to be in it sometimes, I'm sure, unless we take on a monastic vow of some kind. And even then, I suppose there are things that the monks have to do,
monks work
to
right,
tend the garden, but I think it's a matter of slowing down. And that was the brilliance of Dallas Willard. That was, if he had a single message, it was to eliminate hurry from our lives. And I think if we do that, then we're going to be met, our internal dialogue, and external dialogue. What are others telling us? My wife has told me that the last little while, the last few years, she said it's almost like you're a different person. And okay, stepping back, well, what happened? What happened in that? And I've identified definitely some of what happened. In other words, I'm taking her at her word that there is something different that is positive, in terms of not being, Ruth Haley Barton talks about, like a jar of river water all stirred up, to not be that jar of river water all the time. So it's hard to answer your question directly. I think it's different for different people, but eliminating hurry, finding the spiritual practice that really speaks to you. For me, it was journaling, it was nature, it was music, and it was writing.
I love that. Yes, friends, find that thing. And so probably most people have a sort of adverse reaction to spiritual disciplines or things like that, right? Because they're like, oh, one more thing I got to do. But it's not like that at all. Find one thing where you find joy and you can connect with the Lord. One thing I love, and I don't do it often enough, but there's a retreat center here in Colorado, Silent Retreat Center in Sedalia. And I go and I don't talk to anybody. I'm an extrovert. I'm going to go to a conference next week. I'm going to talk to a ton of people. But having time where I'm just quiet, right? And I don't have to do anything. They've got a bunch of paths I can go walk around in the, and get and into nature. And sometimes they'll surprise deer and they'll just walk right up to you. Like, it's crazy. Watching and experiencing God in those moments in a beautiful place. Oh, that's what it is. It's a beautiful place, right? That I can be and I can enjoy. That reflects to me the beauty of God. Maybe you have something like that, friends. It doesn't have to be. I go there for like a whole weekend. I did 5 days once. That was amazing. Okay, you don't have to do that. Maybe it is, like you said, an hour to go sit down and write and just take that little bit of a piece every single day, or doing the examen. There are those things. these are not new paths, right? These are well-worn paths of God's people. We just have to know about them. And maybe my hope is that if you get the language of the soul, you're going to share some of those things with people, right? To help them figure that out. Okay, man, I really deeply have loved this conversation, Jeff. I'm going to remind everybody, friends, you can get the book is called The Language of the Soul, Meeting God in the Longings of Our Hearts. Jeff, where can people find you if they wanted to connect with you?
I do have a website that you can connect with me through. It is jeffreycrosby.net, JEFFREY, crosby.net. There's a place where you could send a note if you wanted to follow up. You can catch me there. Through the ECPA.org website would be another way that you could reach me. So
great.
Either way, feel free.
Do you want to share just a little bit about what the ECPA does?
Yeah, so it's a trade association of Christian publishing. It was founded in 1974. So we're about to celebrate our 50th anniversary. And we exist to help Christian publishers do their work with excellence. So we provide networking and training. We provide ways to help make their books known through awards programs and things like that. We also have a legal counsel that helps with our member publishers with legal compliance and First Amendment issues and things like that. But our primary reason for existing is just to bring publishers who, yes, in some ways are competitors. They may often be bidding on the same books, but we bring them together at events where we can learn from one another, support one another, and share Christian community together. So I have been a part of ECPA virtually since the beginning of my career. So I've spent about 38 of the 50 years of existence of ECPA. So it's been good now for the past 2.5 years to serve as its president. It's a small organization. There are just 5 employees.
Oh, wow.
But we kind of in the Mother Teresa way, small things for a great God.
Yeah, boy, I love that. I do appreciate it. So friends, in case you had never heard of it and you want to be in publishing, if you're already in publishing, you probably already know, but if Christian publishing, but if you want someplace to look, and you've got a conference coming up, I think this will be out before then. Yeah. So, and that's a virtual conference, so you can go anywhere if from anywhere you can attend. So friends, I'll put that link to that as well in the show notes. Jeff, this has been really delightful, just really life-giving for me. I really appreciate your heart and just the way you've shared a little bit of your life. Is there anything you want to leave us with?
No, I just thank you for having me on the show. Continue to have these sorts of conversations that I know are life-giving to your listeners. And for all of you, I just encourage you to be in touch with the longings of your hearts and the ways in which God is meeting you in the midst of them or desires to do so. I believe with all of my heart that is true. And we just need to, as the poet Mary Oliver says, we need to pay attention. That is our calling as men and women of God.
I love it. Thank you.